my involvement with the trans community was that I formed the trans community, the FTM community on the East Coast. There wasn't any other group. There wasn't even a group in New York at the time. The East Coast FTM group was the first, and that.
Most of my work has not been centered on trans communities. I've done some feminist work. I did some work with the Third Wave Foundation that up until recently kind of stayed in working with communities hard hit by HIV and AIDS, including trans women and active drug users and people that are currently HIV positive and particularly low-income folks of color. And so I've done a lot.
At New England Trans Pride, first ever, and
A couple of years ago, I started to talk about, and actually it was 2 years ago precisely, at the Trans Day of Remembrance that was held in Northampton. And I got up and said, you know, I'm tired of this. I'm tired of sitting here mourning every year. You know, I said I challenge everybody here to work with me on a transgender pride march. And I didn't think it would go anywhere. I just thought, you know, there was, you know, sort of I say these things because these things come through my head. It's like channeling. I feel sometimes as an archivist, because I receive so much information and I read so much, that I can kind of channel moments in history, and I'm like, it's almost like group consciousness again coming. And I just said this thing.
My recently ex-girlfriend spent a lot of time in a very bitter trans inclusion fight in the women in trans play party scene, king scene here in New York. The lesbian sex mafia had a policy dictating that how much trans women could undress in an environment where everyone is having sex often with intense themes of violence and domination and whatnot. That like naked trans women could be too triggering. And so this really deeply transphobic policy and a really, you know, horrific battle around changing it. I mean, a battle that led some radical feminists to come to our home and scream at us, you know, among other things. So that's real. I don't really care that much about it. You know, trans communities, particularly as they evolved in the late 80s and 90s, really come out of that legacy of AIDS movements and feminist movements you know, are sort of shared values around trans people have a right to adequate health care, trans people have a right to health care that's specific to our needs to transition, and that the entire edifice of like experts to manage and limit access to that is deeply problematic. And
it was originally the idea came from the trans people of color in New York who marched in 2004, Trans Justice, and I marched down there with them, and it was amazing to be out on the street and be visible, and be safety in numbers, and trans people taking it to the streets. And so when the ENDA debacle happened this past fall, where trans people were left out of the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, we were very angry. We wanted to do something about it, and that's how this came about. The initial email went out in September, and we started organizing and didn't know what to expect, and our own community was very afraid of how this would go, and people were really afraid to be visible and didn't know what would happen. And it was a process of us believing in ourselves. It was a community organizing. We did it in consensus, and M to F's and F to M spectrum came together, and here we are today, and it's happening. So, all right, it's very exciting.
If you like what you've heard here, you can go ahead and access more interviews at transoralhistory.org.